Yo, what is up everyone? Randy here. Today we're going to be talking about the exposure triangle and how it can help you understand manual exposure in your photography. So let's get into it. Alright guys, so the exposure triangle is essentially just made up of three things, and that's your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. And these three things work in conjunction, so you can't change one without having to change the others if you want to keep the same exposure. Now I figured the easiest way to kind of start to understand the exposure triangle is to just go into each of the elements and explain those individually. So if we start off with aperture, your aperture is just a variable element in your lens, and what it does is it either opens up or it closes down. And this controls how much light is going to hit your sensor. Now, one of the things that we need to keep in mind with aperture is while it controls how much light's going to hit your sensor, it also controls the depth of field in your image. I made a video about depth of field describing it a little bit more in depth, but just to give you a basic overview, your depth of field is just how much of your image is going to be in focus. So the shallower depth of field, the less of your image is going to be in focus, and the greater depth of field, the more your image is going to be in focus. And this works based on the bigger the aperture hole is the less depth of field you're going to get, and the smaller the aperture hole is the more depth of field you're going to get. So aperture is measured in f-stops, and usually the f-stop range goes from about f2 to f22. Now you can go down a little bit further, f1.8, f1.4, but just for the purposes of demonstration, let's just say it starts at f2 and it goes to f22. Now this range steps down and it goes from f2 to f4, from f4 to f5.6, from f5.6 to f8 to f11 to f16, and then to f22. And each change between those aperture numbers is actually a decrease in light of 2 times. So you're cutting your light in half. So going from f2 to f4, you're actually cutting your light in half. Going from f4 to f5.6, you're cutting your light in half. Or vice versa. If you're going from f5.6 to f4, you're getting twice as much light into your sensor, and if you're going from f4 to f2, you're getting twice as much light into your sensor as well. So that's how you're going to use aperture inside of the exposure triangle. It's going to control how much light is going to come into your sensor, but it's also going to control the depth of field in your image. So if we just look at the next thing in the exposure triangle, let's look at shutter speed. Now your shutter speed is just how fast your camera is going to take your image. So inside of your camera there is a shutter, whether it's mechanical or electronic, and what that does, it's going to lift up and it's going to expose the sensor to the light for a certain amount of time, and then it's going to close off. So with your shutter speed, it's a similar concept as with your f-stops, but it's measured in fractions of a second. But just as how with your aperture, each full stop would cut down half as much light going into your sensor, that's the same. So if we start at 1 second and then we go to a half second, there's going to be half as much light. If we go from a half second to a quarter second, there's going to be half as much light. From a quarter second to an eighth of a second, half as much light, and so on down the full scale of the shutter speed. Now your shutter speed is also not just going to control how fast your picture is taken, but it's also going to let you control the type of motion that you get in your photos. So if you're trying to capture something and you want to freeze it, you're going to want to choose shutter speeds that are faster. Now, something to keep in mind is if the lighting isn't super good, you might not be able to get away with those faster shutter speeds, or you're going to have to play with the other two elements inside of the exposure triangle to be able to pull off that faster shutter speed. But that's essentially what shutter speed does. It controls how fast your image is taken, and then it allows you to control how much blur or how much motion you're going to freeze inside of your picture. So ISO is measured usually from about 500 to say up to 102,800. For our purposes, usually from ISO 100 to ISO 6400 is the typical range for most cameras. Now, your ISO is going to work the same as your other two elements. So from ISO 100 to ISO 200, your sensor is going to be twice as sensitive to light. From ISO 200 to ISO 400, it's going to be twice as sensitive to light as well. So your ISO is essentially just going to control how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So if you have it at ISO 100, it's going to be less sensitive to light than at ISO 200, and it's going to be half as sensitive. From ISO 100 to ISO 200, you get twice as much sensitivity. So if you go all the way up to ISO 6400, you're dealing with something that's a lot more sensitive. So the amount of light that comes into your camera doesn't have to be as much. but there are some drawbacks. So with higher ISOs, you start to introduce more noise into your images, and you will see this, and it looks like a type of grain, or it kind of looks like this discolored grain. And this isn't good for your images because it degrades the quality of them. Now, depending on your camera will depend on how high of an ISO you can get away with without kind of degrading your image too much. But the typical usable range for most cameras is from ISO 100 to ISO 3200. If you're dealing with some more professional cameras, you can go ISO 6400, maybe ISO 12800, and still have usable images. But for most cameras, it's between ISO 100 and ISO 3200. So how exactly do you choose your ISO? Now, choosing your ISO is going to be based on how much light is available. So if you're shooting in broad daylight during the middle of the day, you're going to choose the lowest possible ISO because there's plenty of light coming into your sensor to reproduce an image. But say you're shooting a little bit later in the evening or even into the night and you still want to be able to get some faster shutter speeds, you're going to want to crank that ISO up so that your camera sensor is a little bit more sensitive. So that's pretty much ISO. You're going to choose it based on how much light is available. The higher ISOs is going to be for darker scenarios and the lower ISOs for lighter scenarios. Now, the three elements inside of the exposure triangle work together, so they work in conjunction, and this is where you really start to get some freedom. So say that it's about 8 or 9 p.m. and we're out shooting a portrait. It's getting a little bit closer to dusk, and we're shooting on a 50mm lens that goes down to f2. Now, to use the exposure triangle, let's say I'm going to shoot at f2 because I want to get a shallow depth of field. And then the next thing I'm going to look at is my shutter speed. And a general rule of thumb with shutter speed is that you never want to shoot below your focal length. So that means I am shooting a 50mm lens. I wouldn't want to shoot below 1/50th of a second. So I'm just going to step that up. Let's say I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second. And what I would do next is, okay, I'm shooting at f2 to get my shallow depth of field and to let a lot of light in because it's dusk, there's not much light out. And then I'm shooting at 1/50th of a second. That's a pretty slow shutter speed. So the next thing that I would do is I would kind of start messing with my ISO until my exposure is correct or until my meter reading is right towards the middle. Now say I take a few photos and I see, okay, that's a little bit too shallow depth of field. I want a little bit more depth of field. I'm going to stop down to f4. Now from f2 to f4, we go from f2, then we go to f2.8, and then we go to f4. So we're going to be losing 4 times as much light. So from f2 to f2.8, you lose twice as much light, and then from f2.8 to f4, you lose another twice as much light. So we're getting 1/4 of the light. Now, if I wanted to compensate for this, I'm already shooting the lowest possible shutter speed, so I know that I can't drop that. So I would want to compensate with my ISO. Now, say I'm shooting at ISO 1600 because I need to get 4 times as much light to reproduce the same exposure that I had earlier. I would go up to 3200 and then up to 6400. So by going from f2 to f4 and then adjusting my ISO from 1600 to 6400, we're going to get the exact same exposure, but we're going to get a little bit more depth of field now. So this is kind of how the exposure triangle works, and how you can start to think of exposure is it's a little bit of a give and take. It's a balance, and that's the balance that you're going to have to find while you're out in the field, based on your look, based on the lighting conditions, based on the time of day, and just based on the type of images that you're trying to make. So that's pretty much the exposure triangle, guys. I hope you found this video helpful. Hit that like button, subscribe. See you next time.